Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Parliament will be suspended next month after the Queen approved the Prime Minister's request to shut it down temporarily. It means the current parliamentary session will come to an end just days after MPs return from their summer break. They'll be back for the Queen's speech when the government will lay out its new agenda less than 3 weeks before Brexit. Boris Johnson said the decision was all about moving forward with the country's future, but it's provoked fierce political criticism from all sides. Critics have called it a constitutional outrage and a smash and grab on our democracy. The Scottish Conservative leader, Ruth Davidson, says she's now considering her position. Our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, is in Westminster. Laura.
Sophie, not so long ago, Boris Johnson said he wasn't attracted to this idea, to use the technical term of proroguing Parliament. But he was careful never to rule this out, an action that many of his critics see as deeply, deeply radical and controversial. Now, as a new Prime Minister, though, he's perfectly entitled to ask for a pause, the opportunity to set out his plans for all sorts of things, the way he wants to run the country. But doing it now is provocative, and many MPs believe that this time he risks making a dangerous precedent of how things are meant to work round here.
Shutting up shop. At the Prime Minister's request, the gates will clang shut here for an extra few days next month. Debates won't take place, MPs won't vote or stand in the way of Boris Johnson.
We're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, making sure that we have the education funding that we need. And there will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
It is not unusual for a new Prime Minister to close Parliament for a short while to press reset to announce a new programme of what they want to do. But it's intensely controversial to do it now, because just as Boris Johnson is determined that we leave the EU at the end of October even without a deal, so a huge group of MPs is equally determined to try to stop him from doing that. And by squeezing their time, he squeezes their chances.
One former minister told me it's a declaration of war. It's certainly the first big shot in a fight that's been brewing since Boris Johnson moved into number 10. And the outrage is shared by senior Tories too.
At a time of national crisis, Parliament must be able to meet, to hold the government to account, to represent our constituents, the electorate up and down the country, and it is profoundly undemocratic to shut Parliament down, to stop it doing its job.
Suspending Parliament is not acceptable, it's not on. What the Prime Minister is doing is a sort of smash and grab on our democracy in order to force through a no-deal exit from the European Union. What's he so afraid of?
He's acting like some kind of tin-pot dictator. It frankly is not acceptable, and if MPs don't stop it, then it is no exaggeration, it is not hyperbole to say this is the day any semblance of UK parliamentary democracy absolutely dies.
The Scottish Tory leader is expected to quit tomorrow after tensions with Johnson, even though those close to her say there are personal reasons too, and the decision is not a direct result of today.
March on our way.
Even the Speaker, who's meant to be impartial, let his fury be shown. He said he'd had no contact from the government, but this move represents a constitutional outrage. He went on to say it's blindingly obvious that the purpose of prorogation now would be to stop Parliament debating Brexit. That would be an offence against the democratic process and the rights of parliamentarians as the people's elected representatives.
Are you ignoring Parliament, Mr Walker? Are you ignoring Parliament? Are you ignoring Parliament, sir?
Ignoring some questions, certainly.
We need to have a Queen's speech. We have a new Prime Minister. He needs a new legislative programme. Thank you very much.
Ministers are all too aware this is controversial and won't be surprised by an onslaught of scrutiny.
James Cavalier, are we in a constitutional crisis?
So I was going to go.
Not exactly all forward about making the case today. But the move was officially sealed with the Queen by a trio of Conservative Privy Councillors who disturbed Her Majesty's own summer recess at her Balmoral estate in the Highlands today.
Are you trying to avoid scrutiny at Parliament?
Certainly not, no.
Are you worried about a legal challenge?
This is a completely proper constitutional procedure and law.
All entirely normal, the Leader of the Commons told us at the airport later. And Brexit backers, guess what? Back this too.
The Prime Minister is entitled to go to Her Majesty the Queen, seek a new Queen's speech, particularly as a new leader and as a new Prime Minister. He wants to set out his domestic agenda, and I don't think there's anything unusual about that.
But nobody can deny that this Parliament has really endlessly debated Brexit. It's hardly talked about anything else. We know everybody's position, we know what their view is.
Boris Johnson wants to write himself into history as the Prime Minister who did what it took to get Brexit done. But the methods he'll pursue to do that could make or break him too. Laura Koonsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So this is what the next few weeks could look like. MPs return to Westminster next Tuesday. They'd normally have had a fortnight before breaking for the party conferences. Most of the following day will now be taken up with the Chancellor Sajid Javid's statement on government spending. Parliament is now due to be suspended as soon as 6 days later. That will allow the government to present its plans in a Queen's speech on Monday, the 14th of October, which MPs then vote on. 3 days after that, Europe's leaders will meet in Brussels, where any renegotiated Brexit deal would have to be discussed. Britain is due to leave the European Union on the last day of October. It all means that MPs who were hoping to block a no-deal Brexit before Halloween will now have very little time to do so in Parliament. Our Home Editor Mark Easton looks at what Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament will mean and how it will work.
It's a matter of time. By announcing a Queen's speech to set out its plans, the government makes it harder for Parliament to stop the clock as the country heads towards Brexit Day on October the 31st, with or without a deal. I met constitutional expert Hannah White on Parliament Square, where else, with 3 questions. First, what is happening?
What it means practically is that MPs and peers will have significantly less time to talk about anything relating to Brexit or otherwise before the Article 50 deadline is reached at the end of October.
A pause. And Her Majesty the Queen.
The Queen's speech ceremony emphasises the tensions between Her Majesty's government and an independent Parliament.
Close the door!
Slamming and banging of doors, a reminder of a sometimes fractious relationship. Although audacious, on this occasion, government ministers appear to have found a constitutionally legitimate way to curb the powers of MPs and peers. So, how does it work?
What we're seeing now is a real showdown between Parliament and government. And what the government's done is quite clever because it really constrains the time available to people in Parliament who want to legislate to try to prevent no deal. If they don't get legislation through in the next couple of weeks, it will fall. They'll have to try again in October, starting from scratch, and getting a bill through the Commons and the Lords in the limited time available, I think, is going to be very difficult. Stop the coup!
With their options narrowing, those who oppose a no-deal Brexit, or even a Brexit at all, will be anxiously discussing tactics. One group of politicians has asked Scotland's top civil court to grant an interim interdict to block the suspension of Parliament. But some believe they may already have missed their chance to delay or stop Britain's departure from the EU at Halloween. So question number 3. Can it be stopped?
I think broadly there are 3 options now. The first is to legislate, but as we've discussed, that's really difficult in terms of the timing. The second is to try to bring the courts into it, but we're really in uncharted territory as to what view the courts would take of a challenge at this point. The third is to try a no confidence vote in the Prime Minister, which could lead to an election. But the thing to bear in mind there is setting the date of the election is up to the Prime Minister, and that could be after Brexit has happened on the 31st of October.
Both sides in this dispute claim the moral high ground, that their way is the truly democratic way, that history will judge them well. But when the dust finally settles on these extraordinary political events, who, if anyone, will be honoured with a statue here at the epicentre of our democracy? Mark Easton, BBC News, Parliament Square.
So how is Boris Johnson's decision to suspend Parliament being viewed across the UK? In a moment we'll hear from Sian Lloyd, who's in Cardiff Bay, and then from our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy, who's in Belfast. But first, our Scotland editor Sarah Smith is at Balmoral, where the Queen met the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and signed the order to agree a suspension of Parliament. Sarah.
And Sophie, the Queen may have had no choice other than to agree to prorogue Parliament when she was visited here at Balmoral by ministers earlier today, but she will have been very clear about what the implications potentially could be. You can hear there are protesters outside the gates of Balmoral already. And being in Scotland, the Queen will have been aware of what this could mean for the Union. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has already said that she thinks that Boris Johnson has now made Scottish independence completely inevitable. Scotland, of course, voted to remain inside the European Union, and the SNP say they'll work with any other opposition parties to do whatever they can to try and stop a no-deal Brexit. But at the same time, they do believe that this current political turmoil does make it more likely that Scottish voters would choose to leave the UK if they were offered the choice in another independence referendum. And of course, the other big political news here in Scotland is that we understand the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, is now set to quit. She's always been a fierce opponent of a no-deal Brexit. She didn't support Boris Johnson for the leadership and has been at odds with him since he became Prime Minister. She obviously feels she can no longer defend his policies or his actions. We expect an official statement from her about that tomorrow. And I'll hand now to my colleague Emma Vardy in Belfast.
Well, that move to suspend Parliament has been roundly criticised by parties here in Northern Ireland, except for one. The Democratic Unionists, the Tories, partners in Westminster, are getting behind this strategy. Now, that's not surprising if you remember that the DUP's main problem was with Theresa May's old withdrawal agreement, which included in it for them the dreaded backstop, which could have meant Northern Ireland facing different treatment after Brexit. So the DUP see this as Boris Johnson rejecting that and see it as him showing the EU that he means business. But of course, Northern Ireland is deeply divided on this. Northern Ireland, a majority of people here voted to remain in the referendum. And the DUP's rivals, Sinn Féin, have called Boris Johnson's strategy a callous political play. It's also been called disgraceful and anti-democratic by others today. And that is because people here opposed to Brexit fear that a no-deal scenario could tear apart trading links with the Republic of Ireland and cost thousands of jobs. So for many people here today, that worst case scenario just got a lot closer. And now we'll hear from Sean Lloyd.
Overall, the people of Wales voted to leave the European Union, but the position of the Labour-run Welsh Government here in Cardiff Bay has always been that to leave the EU without a deal would be catastrophic for the Welsh economy, and there has been significant anger here from the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford, at this move, which would make it more difficult.
Apologies there for the sound quality from Cardiff, but thank you all. Well, it's been a turbulent day for the financial markets. The value of the pound has fallen following the news. It is down 0.5% against the euro and US dollar. It means £1 is worth €1.10, and against the US currency, £1 will buy you $1.22. So what do voters make of today's dramatic news? Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been talking to people in Stratford-upon-Avon.
During the last days of summer on the banks of the Avon, the seismic moves in Westminster might seem a world away. But at the Deli Cafe in the town centre, there is Brexit talk. Owner Jean voted to leave and welcomes what she sees as decisive action from the Prime Minister.
We've had 3 years to do this. So MPs, I think now, let him do it. MPs, suspend Parliament and get on with Brexit.
Some of the cafe's regulars, friends from across the Midlands, have a similar view.
It's sad that these little core of politicians who didn't like what we, the public, voted for, have thrown their rattles out of the pram and caused all this fuss. And I just think Boris is absolutely right.
I'm surprised that he can actually prorogue Parliament, but at the same time, it's not democratic what's happening in Parliament at the moment.
The referendum result here almost mirrored the national picture, and this town is still divided.
If normal procedures are being suspended, that's always very alarming, isn't it?
I think what he's doing is great, because otherwise we're not going to get the democracy, which is what 52% of this country voted for.
Sophie and Manuela set up a Brexit cafe to get people to talk through differences. Both EU citizens, they're worried about the future.
It's, Boris Johnson is turning into a tyrant. We've lived with anxiety and uncertainty for more than 3 years, and it's just getting worse.
He promised during the Leave campaign to defend this parliamentary democracy. Can't think why, with a divided country, a government want to actually divide it even more.
They're part of a local pro-Europe group, angry at the decision to suspend Parliament.
To hear it might actually happen, you can't believe it. We are now no longer the fair-minded, well-balanced democracy we all thought we were when we were growing up.
So the constitutional arguments may be raging far from here, but so is the row across the country about the best way out of this crisis. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Stratford-upon-Avon.
Well, let's talk to our Europe editor now, Katya Adler. And the Prime Minister is certainly playing hardball. Does it make any new agreement more likely?
Well, look, suspending Parliament and the arguments for and against it at such a crucial time in UK politics, the EU sees that as very much a domestic affair, and that's why the European Commission, for example, and Angela Merkel today refused to comment. But if you're asking me whether the Prime Minister's actions today have made EU leaders sit up, smell the coffee and realise that he's serious about a no-deal Brexit, you know what? They believed him already, and that belief has not sent EU leaders scurrying into a dark room in a panic, trying to look for any compromise to avoid a no-deal Brexit. And basically that's because when the EU does compromise, and it does so when it thinks that it's in its wider interest. But getting rid of the Irish backstop without a workable alternative in place, which would mean exposing the whole of the European single market, the EU doesn't think it's worth it, even though it will definitely suffer in the case of a no-deal Brexit. Do you remember that famous refrain of Theresa May's that no deal is better than a bad deal? Well, EU leaders think the very same thing. But if you're asking me whether they will now work with the Johnson government to try and look at possible alternatives, well, that's already happening in an informal lower level already across the channel.
Well, thank you. Well, let's go back to Westminster now and talk to our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. It was certainly a surprise. How much of a gamble is this for Boris Johnson?
Well, Sophie, first off, we should be clear that the doors of Parliament are not going to be slammed for weeks and weeks and weeks and months on end. Essentially, what Number 10 is going to do is extend the break that MPs were already being given to go off to their party conferences around the seaside. That doesn't mean, though, it's not controversial, and it doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It has made a lot of people very angry, including some very senior MPs. There are some protests that have already started in Westminster tonight, where we can probably see now people gathering here to express their anger at what has been done. But politically, for Number 10, some of their supporters might believe actually that this move makes some of the right people angry. In other words, by making those people who they believe have been blocking Brexit cross, actually that will be the kind of thing that delights the people who were pleased to see Boris Johnson moving into Number 10. Technically, they are, of course, within their rights to do this. Politically, though, some people are worried that it does really push at the precedents, those unwritten rules that make sure that things in Westminster run smoothly. But just lastly, I think what this does also do is show us this Number 10 is going to be provocative. They are going to pull off political moves that drive some people crazy and delight others. And I think that does probably make it clearer that we are moving towards a possible general election. One cabinet minister said to me today, we all know that an election is coming. The only question now is when.
Laura Kuenssberg, thank you.
Westminster is in shock tonight after Boris Johnson announced that Parliament will be suspended ahead of a Queen's speech in mid-October. The move, which the House of Commons Speaker called a constitutional outrage, appears to put the Prime Minister on a direct collision course with MPs. It leaves little time to debate a no-deal Brexit, but Mr Johnson insists he's not trying to silence opponents. In a fresh twist, it's emerged that Ruth Davidson is set to quit as Scottish Conservative leader. Our political correspondent Paul Brand reports.
Tonight, the power is shifting from Parliament to Prime Minister. No need to defeat MPs when he can just dismiss them, suspending their work, allegedly, so he can get on with his own and announce a plan for government.
We're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, making sure that we have the education funding that we need. And there will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
But today that time was officially cut short by the Queen, who issued the order to prorogue Parliament from here in Balmoral. 3 members of the government flying up to deliver Her Majesty's directions, refuting claims of a coup.
So they wouldn't know what they were talking about. It's normal functioning of our constitution.
But as for the functioning of Parliament, well, MPs return there on Tuesday before it's quickly suspended sometime the next week. That means instead of returning after party conferences on the 7th of October, they won't be back until there's a Queen's speech on the 14th, just days ahead of a vital EU summit and leaving virtually no time to block leaving without a deal on Halloween.
What the Prime Minister's doing is a sort of smash and grab on our democracy in order to force through a no-deal exit from the European Union. What's he so afraid of that he needs to suspend Parliament to prevent Parliament discussing these matters?
It's dictatorship. And if MPs don't find a way of coming together next week to stop Boris Johnson in his tracks, then today will go down in history as the day any semblance of UK democracy died.
The Speaker, John Bercow, added, however it's dressed up, it is blindingly obvious that the purpose of prorogation now would be to stop Parliament debating Brexit and performing its duty in shaping a course for the country. Shutting down Parliament would be an offence against the democratic process, suggesting he'll help MPs act quickly. And tonight, this senior Conservative already has. Ruth Davidson is expected to resign as Scottish leader tomorrow, as others in her party urge action.
A number of my colleagues would have preferred to wait and move in late September. That will now not be possible. We will have to try to do something when Parliament returns next week.
Stop the coup!
The protests, though, don't come from all quarters. Others are happy to vacate their benches, insisting it's nothing unusual.
People will say, you campaigned to bring democracy back to Parliament and now you're in favour of closing Parliament down.
That is yeah, but you could say that, but it's absolutely wrong. Parliament is not being closed down. The period is exactly how you would do it under any parliamentary period.
But tonight, the period we live in feels unlike any other. Protesters managing to break through the barriers outside Parliament, arguing it's the Prime Minister who's crossing the line.
Well, right now, even the best brains in Britain can't predict where this constitutional crisis is headed. It's possible that next week MPs will still pass a law trying to stop no deal. The big question is whether it can get through the Lords in time. Unlike other countries, we don't have a written constitution. These rules aren't all neatly drawn up on paper. I suspect if they were, a fair few pages by now would have been torn up.
Paul, indeed. Thank you. Right, more now on the news that a key figure in the Conservative Party, Ruth Davidson, is set to quit as its leader in Scotland. Well, we're joined now from Glasgow by STV correspondent Bernard Ponsonby. Bernard, do we know why she's made this decision?
Well, nobody senior in the Scottish Conservative Party is disabusing us of the idea that she will resign in the morning. What they are doing is disabusing us of the idea that there's a direct link between the Prime Minister's decision today on parliamentary prorogation and her resignation. And that tells me that this is perhaps to do with lifestyle issues. Ruth Davidson has just recently become a parent, and she has perhaps concluded that juggling the responsibilities of parenthood with leading a political party are simply too great. But she's going to be a hard act to follow. The Scottish Conservatives have supplanted Labour in Scotland as the main challengers to the SNP in the Holyrood Parliament, and whoever decides that they want to succeed her, they're going to be hounded by a series of questions. Do they back the Prime Minister and his personality? Do they back the Prime Minister and his Brexit strategy? Do they back the direction of travel of the Prime Minister? Or is it time for the Scottish Conservatives to go it alone?
Okay, Bernard, thanks very much for that. Well, our political editor, Robert Peston, has joined us in the studio. Robert, before we get to you, let's take a look again at those pictures from Abingdon Green. These are live shots from Abingdon Green with a protest that has been growing as the afternoon goes on, with people opposed to that decision by Boris Johnson to suspend Parliament. I mean, Robert, how big a crisis is this for the country?
So look, Boris Johnson is a great admirer of the US President Donald Trump. I saw that at first hand only a couple of days ago at the G7 in Biarritz. And this is Johnson actually playing from the Trumpian rulebook, which is trying to get his way by doing things very, very differently. Most people would say the conventional approach is you let MPs have their say. He is massively curtailing their ability to do that, but he says he needs to do that, otherwise he cannot persuade the EU that he is serious about a no-deal Brexit, because the EU is looking at our Parliament and thinking that Parliament can block a no-deal Brexit. That's why he's in effect closing Parliament down. Now, if he succeeds, then who knows what will happen in that summit on the 18th and 19th of October. Maybe the EU will budge and offer him a deal that he can take. But then we're into the extraordinary position of MPs being asked to approve extraordinarily complicated legislation in record-breaking time, which we've never seen. OK, so that would also be unprecedented. Now, if MPs succeed in forcing him to delay Brexit, which they're going to try and do through legislation next week, then my view is the odds on a general election are then very high, because he will then say to the country, I am representing you, I am representing the 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit, and I want a renewed mandate in a general election to push that through. And, you know, my goodness, we're going to have one hell of an autumn.
Indeed we will. Robert, thanks very much.
Welcome. The Brexit crisis is now entering uncharted waters, even for our flexible, unwritten constitution. It just took the Queen to give her consent, and it was done. Parliament will be prorogued or suspended for just over a month, from the second week in September until just a few days before Brexit. It's not unusual for Parliament to be suspended for a few days before a Queen's speech, when the government sets out its plans for new laws. What's different this time is the length and, of course, the questions around the motivation, in the heart of a political crisis. Jacob Rees-Mogg, questioned by journalists after his meeting with the Queen, described it as a completely normal procedure. But is it? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is here. Is it?
We were talking yesterday about how all those opposition parties were getting together, the opponents of no deal, to try to frustrate the idea of no deal using legislation. Today what Number 10 did was effectively throw down one of those spike strips, the tyre shredders that people put down in front of that track. And as you say, they are using a long-standing convention. You suspend or prorogue Parliament when you're going to start a new session, but they are using it with specific intent. They intend to narrow the window for people they think intend to create mischief, and they think themselves are going to stretch the orthodoxies of our unwritten constitution, and probably will start doing it next week. So there is a battle on both sides now, nearly fully engaged. Next week, probably horribly, bloodily engaged. Who is currently the most destabilised by today? Well, some of the people who are planning to create mischief and frustrate no deal next week are saying this is concentrating minds wonderfully amongst, say, potential Tory rebels, who they need to come over to their side and back their legislative attempts. But I'm also talking to people who've been lobbied by Number 10, and they're beginning to buy into the argument, oh, why don't we leave this to the other side of this long suspension? There is a little window there, the other side, where maybe then, if we're not happy with what things are looking like, maybe then we could pounce. The other side is saying, no, that's too late, don't touch that option. I think another sign that things are destabilised slightly on the, more than slightly, on the anti-no deal front, the fact that they moved to the legislative track yesterday en masse, all these parties, and today they started talking again about a vote of no confidence. The thing they were thinking probably wouldn't work. That tells you something. It also tells you that we could have a general election to add to the excitements of a day that unfolded in Aberdeenshire this morning. Into the serene calm of the Queen's Balmoral summer retreat,
It really is rather gloomy today, Alfred.
enter a massive political storm. Jacob Rees-Mogg, along with the government chief whip, were dispatched by Number 10 to get the Queen to sign off on a new parliamentary session.
People might say this is an undemocratic move.
Say they wouldn't know what they were talking about. It's normal functioning of our constitution.
It was, he said, just a new government setting out its agenda, not how others saw it. Jeremy Corbyn and the Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson wrote to the Queen saying, "Don't do it." Their letters were too late. The order had been signed.
I'm sorry to have kept you
Was the
waiting.
Queen happy to see Jacob Rees-Mogg?
You must ask Her Majesty that.
Labour's Shadow Chancellor said this is a very British coup. Nicola Sturgeon called Boris Johnson a tin pot dictator.
Critics will say this is an insult to democracy and denying the MPs the time they need to debate and possibly vote on Brexit.
No, well, that is completely untrue. If you look at what we're doing, we're bringing forward a new legislative programme on crime, on hospitals, and making sure that we have the education funding that we need.
The Speaker, John Bercow, responded, it was blindingly obvious the intention was to stop Parliament debating Brexit and performing its duty in shaping a course for the country. Shutting down Parliament, he said, would be an offence against the democratic process. Here's the parliamentary calendar that opponents of no deal thought they were dealing with. The highlighted days show sitting days of the House of Commons. And next week, MPs who oppose no deal were hoping to force the government to cancel the break that happens for the conference season, adding even more sitting days to the tally they could play with, perhaps around 39 of them. The effect of today is to drastically reduce the number of sitting days of the House of Commons. If MPs who oppose no deal want to change the law in some way to stop no deal, they probably have just 5 days, starting next week, to start and finish that project.
I think it's looking very difficult. There are a number of steps that would need to be taken, and probably using an emergency debate to take time on the floor of the House, and then all the stages of the bills in both houses, remember. So getting through the Commons and the Lords looks very challenging.
He's shot their fox, probably.
It certainly looks like a good way to constrain the forces who are trying to prevent a no-deal exit.
There will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues. Ample time.
The Labour leader didn't buy that and insisted he might yet try to bring the government down with a vote of no confidence.
When Parliament does meet on his timetable very briefly next week, the first thing we'll do is attempt legislation to prevent what he's doing, and secondly, we'll challenge him on a motion of confidence at some point.
Wading in yet again, President Trump tweeted it would be hard for Jeremy Corbyn to seek a no-confidence vote against Boris Johnson, as Boris Johnson is exactly what the UK has been looking for and will prove to be a great one. Love UK.
We do, in Her Majesty's name and in obedience to Her Majesty's commands, prorogue this Parliament to the second
This was
day
the
of
last parliamentary ceremony proroguing or suspending Parliament ahead of the 2017 general election. It's a traditional device being used with highly political intent to gobble up parliamentary time. Proof of that, Tories lining up this summer to trash the idea, then floated by Dominic Raab.
I think it would be a terrible thing if, having said that we should have more power in this country and trust our institutions more, we did, as Dom seems to be implying, and shut the doors on Parliament.
That goes against everything that those men who waded onto those beaches fought and died for. And I will not have it.
It is a ridiculous suggestion to consider proroguing Parliament.
You don't deliver on democracy by trashing democracy. You know, we're not selecting a dictator of our country.
I'm not attracted to archaic devices like proroguing.
Not attracted then, seduced now.
We need to get on with our domestic agenda, and that's why we're announcing a Queen's speech for October the 14th. Okay? Thank you.
A battle of political wills and wits is underway. The government's stretching of convention will next week be mirrored by their opponents in Parliament.
Stop the coup! Stop the coup!
The unwritten constitution creaking as politics polarises and anger intensifies.
Well, 3 politicians in a room with the Queen is all it took to suspend Parliament. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, is at Balmoral, where it happened. Alex, tell us what happened.
Well, yes, and in many senses what the government, what Boris Johnson is saying that this was a routine matter is actually true, although of course the circumstances of how it was done are anything but routine. 2 anti-Brexit protesters come all the way from Newcastle upon Tyne to protest against this this morning. But what's been going on is really a very almost perfunctory affair. The Privy Council has to have 3 people to be quorate. Obviously, the leader would be Jacob Rees-Mogg as leader of the House and Lord President of the Privy Council. He would have gone in. It would have taken place in the library here at Balmoral, where the Queen conducts state business. She gets state papers most days except Mondays. They would have lit a candle, would you believe, to show that the meeting was in session, and then essentially Jacob Rees-Mogg would have read out, or one of the Privy Councillors would have read out the proclamation, effectively telling the Queen what to do, and the monarch would have said words to the effect of, "I assent." One other little detail for you: these meetings are conducted standing up, on the commendable and time-tested idea that if people stand up, they fall out of love with the sound of their own voices, and meetings happen very effectively. So perhaps we could all learn something from that.
At extraordinary circumstances, did the Queen have any room for manoeuvre?
Short answer to that, Jackie, a flat and definite no. There's nothing like our unwritten constitution for bending the meaning and abusing what verbs stand for. So we talk about these situations of the Queen being advised about the proroguing of Parliament or assenting to it. She has very little choice in the matter. The circumstance of this prorogation may be unusual, to put it politely, and highly political, and it's fair to say that the Queen will not have seen one like this in her time on the throne. But it's also true that for the monarch to actually say no to this in any sense is simply unthinkable. People worry about our democracy, but at least is in a firmer sense of health than that.
Alex Thompson, thanks very much. Well, now, in the last hour, it's emerged that the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party will resign her post tomorrow. Ruth Davidson famously locked horns with Boris Johnson during the referendum and had opposed no deal. She was also against any move to suspend Parliament. Well, our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins is in Edinburgh. Kieran, we'll hear from you later about other reaction in Scotland. But first, what can you tell us about Ruth Davidson?
Well, nobody really saw this one coming. Up until very recently, she was still saying she wanted to be First Minister of Scotland. A source very close to her tonight, though, denying reports that she's about to resign as the leader of the Scottish Conservatives after 8 years. We're told she'll make her position clear probably tomorrow. We don't yet know her reasons for quitting, for stepping aside. Of course, she returned to work just a few months ago after becoming a mum and taking maternity leave. There was no prospect of her talking to any media today. They were refusing all requests for interviews. But she has previously said, as you say, she would not support a no-deal Brexit. And as you say, there was no secret that she didn't see eye to eye with Boris Johnson. They clashed on the debate stage during the EU referendum. And this was how she greeted, remember, his exit from the 2016 Tory leadership contest.
Ruthie, please, the Boris is out. I don't know. Leadership's not for everyone. Some people just haven't got it. Maybe he's one of them. Were you surprised by Michael Gove?
Well, Ruth Davidson, she took the Scottish Tories into second place here in Holyrood and made gains in Westminster. That, she thought, gave her leverage. And whatever the reasons that emerged for her resignation, Boris Johnson and her were not best of friends. We don't know if it was political, if it was personal. We do know that she has become the face of the opposition to independence and Scotland, and if she does go, then Boris Johnson too will have lost a very formidable opponent.
Thanks, Kieran. Now, we did, of course, ask the government to put up a minute to discuss today's suspension of Parliament, but Downing Street told us that they wanted Boris Johnson's brief clips shared by all broadcasters to speak for themselves. The leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, gave a similar television clip where he also wasn't asked a series of in-depth questions. But Labour did put up a senior minister, the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. I began by asking him if the suspension of Parliament was indeed a coup.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. When you have a Prime Minister...
What kind of coup?
It's one in which you're trying to prevent the operation of the normal democratic institutions. So I think that you would describe that as a coup, where the Prime Minister substitutes himself for the parliamentary process. They know what they're doing. Look, we knew this was coming. We've been contemplating it all through the summer and looking at what actions we can take.
But they've left you just enough time, haven't they, in those 4 or 5, those days that are left, to start the kind of legislation that you might want to start to prevent a no-deal Brexit?
Could be. It's incredibly tight, though, and it doesn't take much to get a bit of a filibuster in the House of Lords to prevent this sort of thing. I think what they're trying to do is most probably prevent us preventing a no-deal by shortening the parliamentary timetable and then blaming us for that. Yeah. And then maybe saying, well, we'll now have a general election, it'll be people versus Parliament, but people see through that.
You're going to fall into that trap?
No, not at all. What we'll try and do next week is be straight with people. We're opposed to no deal. There was a majority opposed to no deal last time we had a vote on this matter. We'll try and get legislation through that will prevent that happening. But if there is then a general election, we'll be honest with people, explain what no deal consequences are, and that's why we try to prevent it.
But if you manage to pass legislation to prevent a no deal Brexit, and he then asks for a general election, triggers a general election, you'd be obliged to go along with that, wouldn't you?
Well, we'll see how he poses that general election, because there's a whole range of options open to us then. The whole parliamentary process now has been opened up by Boris Johnson's intervention, which is trying to prevent democracy. And interestingly, on all sides of the House now, we're saying we're not going to have that. We will assert democratic rights of individual MPs.
So what exactly is the legislative path open to you now for preventing a no-deal Brexit?
Okay. There are a cross-party group that are now drafting up a legislative proposal which will have a range of options in it, as far as I'm aware. Now, they'll then publish that proposal, and it will be around making sure that we're not in a situation where a no deal is forced upon us without parliamentary decision making.
But you need to take control of the parliamentary timetable.
It does do that, as we did before, if you remember, when there was a previous vote like this.
If it did come to a general election, would you only agree to one if an extension of the Brexit deadline was a precondition?
That'll be part of the debate that we have to have within Parliament itself. Do you know, by doing this, as I say, what Boris Johnson has done, he's actually re-excited MPs to say we want a democratic parliament.
But if you had a general election before the Brexit deadline, the Prime Minister is in a much stronger position to unite the Brexit camp against the divided Remain camp.
Well, I think, you see, even the Brexit camp now is quite split, because most of them...
Really?
I don't think they want no deal. They didn't, when they were campaigning in the referendum, they weren't
campaigning. But they'd rather have a Brexit than not a Brexit, and if that's the choice for them.
I think calmer minds are coming to this matter now. The number of Conservative MPs in particular who may have voted for Brexit issues in the past in line with party policy, I think they're now saying, well, actually, we now know the consequences of a no-deal Brexit in particular, and we now know we've got a Prime Minister who'll go to the extremes of overriding Parliament to achieve that.
You are 12 points behind in the opinion polls. No. And this is an open goal.
Well, let's see for
the Labour Party, and you're not scoring.
Well, let's have a look at the trends in those polls, because we were either neck and neck with the Tories or just ahead in recent polls. Boris Johnson comes along. You'd expect a Prime Minister to get a new Prime Minister to get a huge bounce. He didn't. He got less of a bounce than Theresa May.
But isn't the truth this, John McDonnell, that the Remain side, especially your party, is very divided? And the Brexit side is divided between the Brexit Party and the Tory Party, and those divisions are being negotiated away every single day.
Well, isn't it interesting? Jeremy Corbyn convened a meeting yesterday of all the opposition parties, and he united the opposition to this government around opposition to no deal.
This is after weeks of opposition about whether he should be caretaker Prime Minister.
It needed that discussion to take place, and he did it.
He's united the opposition around the fact that he shouldn't be Prime Minister.
No, he's united the opposition yesterday about finding a parliamentary mechanism to block a no deal. We've got a joint endeavour now. What's interesting, it then split the Conservative Party.
Final question. You're not known as one of the most devout monarchists in the country. Do you have any sympathy for the Queen?
Yes, I do. Look, I've always had a lot of respect for the Queen. I've always expressed that. I'm not a monarchist, I'm a Republican. The issue is, as the Constitution now stands, she has to abide by what the Prime Minister brings to her. Now, it's the Prime Minister that's put her in this impossible position, so I do feel for her, and he shouldn't have done that.
So are you a Republican that's asking a monarch to overstep their constitutional powers?
No, I'm a Republican saying to a Prime Minister just behave like a prime minister and not in this, well, reckless and irresponsible way.
John McDonnell, thanks very much.
Thanks.
Well, with me now is resident historian at the Institute of Government, Dr. Catherine Haddon, and expert on parliamentary protocol, and John Curtis, who's Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and a leading analyst of public opinion, talking to us from Glasgow. Let's talk to you, Catherine, first. Thanks for coming, by the way. Is it a coup or is it just a massaging of the diary?
I think it's somewhere between the two of those. Look, this is constitutionally, the Prime Minister is able to do this, and the Queen could not, in these circumstances, refuse him.
And it's not unprecedented.
It's not unprecedented either. Of course, we have at this every end of a parliamentary session to have prorogation, but also using prorogation in this way, that's certainly happened before. Politically, though, it's a very risky move and a very bold move in terms of the opposition that the government has now united together because of doing this. So
do you think
it may have backfired from them.
And do you think the boldness of the government's move here is proportional to the thinness of their majority?
That's difficult to judge. I mean, clearly you have a government now that is more willing to take these riskier manoeuvres. There's been a lot of talk over the whole of the summer about what they might try and do and the different manoeuvres that they do. There's still more talk today about even bolder things that they might do, of calling multiple bank holidays to try and get through the time between now and October the 31st. So I don't think this will be the last of those sort of risky, bold manoeuvres that the government
So what
takes.
are the various options at the opposition's disposal now?
Well, what we're all looking for is what happens next week when Parliament returns, and we think most likely is they'll try to bring some kind of legislation. First of all, try and get control of the parliamentary agenda, and then try to bring some kind of legislation. And given the mood of the Speaker today, I suspect that he will be very much on side of those MPs who are trying to take control again in the way that they did in the spring.
Let's turn to John Curtis in Glasgow. John Curtis, do you think this might be a trap for the opposition? In other words, you pass no-deal legislation trying to get rid of no-deal Brexit, and then we can use that as an electoral ploy against you in a forthcoming general election.
Well, that is an electoral ploy, so long as the opposition are willing to play along with it. We should remember that under the terms of the Fixed Terms Parliament Act, it requires the votes of 2/3 of MPs to vote in favour of an election, and if indeed the response of the government to a successful attempt by those in the anti-no deal camp to legislate away that possibility, they could say, well, I'm terribly sorry, Prime Minister, but we don't agree there should be an election this side of the 31st of October. And in those circumstances, well, shall we say it's going to be very difficult for the government to call an election. He would have to get rid of the Fixed Term Parliament Act first.
Now, when they engage in this extraordinary political gamble, the government must have been looking at some numbers somewhere. Are there numbers out there that are telling them that a risky gamble like this can actually pay off?
Well, in effect, what Boris Johnson is trying to do electorally is to unite the Leave camp, which is around half of the public, and is hoping that the Remain camp, which has been seriously divided in the wake of European Parliament elections between Labour and Lord Democrats and the SNP north of the border, that Remain voters remain divided. So far, he's had some success. Basically, since the end of May, support for the Brexit Party has gone down by around 5 or 6 points. Support for the Tories has gone up by 5 or 6 points. And essentially, what one has to remember is that those people who voted for the Brexit Party are indeed the one section of our electorate who are overwhelmingly in favour of leaving without a deal. And that's the group he's hoping to win over. And certainly insofar as you're suggesting there's a trap, yes, the risk the Remain side face is that if they do precipitate a general election, that Mr Johnson will be able to unite the Leave vote and the Remain vote remains divided. But that said, remember what Nigel Farage said yesterday. The condition for the Brexit Party to be willing to, as it were, not stand and not compete against Mr Johnson is that he leaves without a deal. Now, at the moment, that's not the government's position. One of the other things that I think we discovered today is that insofar as the Prime Minister is still minded to try and get a deal, he now sees the Council in mid-October as a suitable date. Quite a few of those Brexiteers who are applauding his manoeuvre today are also still saying, but getting rid of the Northern Ireland backstop would not be enough for us to vote for Mr Johnson's deal.
Okay. Catherine, to you, I mean, are we setting ourselves up for what we said at the beginning of the programme might be a major constitutional crisis? Parliament against the government, with the people and the referendum being used as the kind of key bargaining chip?
I think we're already into that situation of Parliament versus the executive, definitely. Whether or not this blows up into a full-blown constitutional crisis, I mean, that's the point at which things start to break down in terms of the
But
constitution.
we're not there yet.
We're not yet there. We're in a political crisis, we're in a national crisis, but we've been in one for some months.
Catherine Haddon, John Curtis, thank you very much to both of you. So does all this talk of prorogation and constitutional crisis mean that anything outside Parliament? So far, more than 500,000 people have signed an online petition demanding a halt to moves to suspend Parliament, while at least a dozen protests have been organised up and down the country, from Edinburgh in the north to Brighton in the south. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshna Soni has been talking to voters in Dudley North, one of the most marginal seats in the country.
We're not going to wait until October the 31st before getting on with our plans to take this country forward. And that's why we are going to have a Queen's speech, and we're going to do it on October the 14th.
Wednesday is the most popular market day here in Dudley. Marlene Whittingham and Barry Thompson had just finished their weekly ballroom dancing session when they heard news of Boris Johnson's announcement.
You support what Boris Johnson is doing? Yes. They're talking today about him possibly suspending Parliament, though. Are you worried about that?
No, because he's going to do that to stop Mr Corbyn vote no confidence. So he wants to stop him coming out there to deal. Well, come out, whatever.
Interesting what the Queen says, anyway.
The Friends like shopping here, but admit it's seen better days. This is a town that has suffered the decline of industry, of the steelworks and the foundries.
The town centre, it just declines. You've got a lot of shops closed, and you get more shops open, like what I call the Mifty shops, like Acorn and the Heart Foundation.
Charity shops.
Charity shops.
Adrian Collins is a pub manager. However controversial today's announcement from Westminster, Mr Collins doesn't think it will make any difference.
I voted to leave UK, EU, and it's been so dragged out now. I don't care if we do or if we don't.
You've had enough of the whole thing?
I've had enough of the whole bunch of lies from both sides.
Mr Collins now feels that no mainstream party represents him, like many in this town where 70% voted to leave.
However controversial Boris Johnson's decision, the Tories hope that it'll appeal to voters in areas like Dudley North, which they'll be targeting in the next election. This area has previously always voted Labour, but in the last election their majority was reduced to just 22 after widespread disillusionment over Brexit.
Kevin Moore's family have run a stall here for 80 years.
So all this talk today about what's going on in Parliament, do you feel it affects your life, or do you feel it's kind of removed down in London?
Well, it's all London-based, isn't it? It's like a different country down there. They treat us all different.
And it's that feeling that the goings-on at Westminster are far removed from people's everyday lives that won't change here, whether Parliament is suspended or not. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Dudley.
Well, with me now are the Conservative former Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood and the Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran. Thanks to both of you for coming here. Let me start with you, John Redwood. Boris Johnson has a majority of 1. He was elected by a majority of 140,000 members of the Tory party. He has no mandate from the electorate, and yet he has done this. Outrageous.
Well, we have the biggest democratic mandate ever of the 17.4 million people who voted for the referendum and wished to see it implemented.
That was not a mandate to suspend Parliament.
And Boris and I and many other MPs were elected in that general election in 2017, and we're still covered by that manifesto and that mandate. And if this Parliament really doesn't want this government, then it has to table and win the relevant votes to get a general election. I don't think they're about to do that.
But we are a parliamentary democracy. That building over there has a task, and that's to keep an eye on the executive.
Yes, indeed, and it's doing it.
You're suspending them for 5 weeks at a crucial time of our history.
Well, I don't see it like that. We're following precedent. We always have 3 weeks off for the party conferences, and then we usually have a short gap at the end of each parliamentary year. Now, the previous government decided to go on for the biggest ever long session It is high time we had a new Queen's speech and a full debate about the direction of the government with a new Prime Minister. I'm looking forward to that Queen's speech, and I would recommend opposition MPs join in that debate.
And Lena Moran, if you don't like what they're doing, you can just, vote against the government, have a vote of no confidence.
If they allowed us, you know what? I want.
You can have a vote of no confidence next week on the 3rd of September.
I think it's utterly ridiculous that at a time of crisis, if you were in any other job and your organisation was going through a crisis, let alone the country, us as parliamentarians should be able to do our job. You're absolutely right. 5 weeks. Parliament has never been prorogued for 5 weeks before. And actually, I would argue, why on earth would we have a conference recess?
But hang on a minute, we have the conference season anyway.
Well, we shouldn't.
Right, okay. But we have the conference season anyway. I mean, you've got 4 fewer days to do the business that you want to do than you would have done without this. Surely, if you get your act together, you can do the things you want to do.
Well, that is already happening. And if there is anything that this has achieved, it has certainly concentrated the minds. We have now decided, once and for all, we are going the legislative route. We are going to, when we come back, there is a host of different ways we can do this. And critically, there is a speaker who has said that he will help Parliament be sovereign. We have a parliamentary democracy. Parliament must remain sovereign.
We know about the options. We talked about the options to the last previous guests. What are you going to do? Which one do you personally prefer?
Well, I'm not in charge,
it's time
first of all.
to choose.
But second
tick
of all,
tock, tick tock.
absolutely. And the best minds in Parliament and across the country in terms of legislation are looking at this now. I will back whichever one is going to stop no deal. But the point is, Boris Johnson is basically a coward. He doesn't want to face us parliamentarians. He is stopping the people through their representatives for having their voice, and this must be stopped, and it will be stopped.
And if Prime Minister Jeremy Corbyn can stop a no deal, are you okay with that?
Everyone is pulling together to make sure that no deal will not happen.
John Redwood, the majority of people in this country do not want a no deal Brexit. Is it fair to enforce this, to shove this down their throats at this, very delicate stage?
The majority of people in Britain want this over.
But they don't want a no-deal
Brexit. We
Brexit.
should implement the decision of the British people. Many people would have liked a good deal, and Mrs May always said it was either good deal or no deal. She wouldn't accept bad deal. Her deal was a dreadful deal. The public and Parliament said it was a dreadful deal, so we must get on and leave.
What makes you think that after the 31st of October, if we leave without a deal, that suddenly things are going to be hunky-dory with the EU? We still need to fashion a future relationship with them.
Well,
you're storing up an awful lot of bad blood for the next
stage. And we will
stage.
be doing an enormous amount of trade with them once we've left, because the World Trade Organization governs all that. We will be cutting the tariffs on imports, and we will, of course, have access to their market, just as America and China has access to their market.
This has been absolutely debunked. But the point, people are scared. A no-deal Brexit has real consequences, particularly for the most vulnerable. We're talking about food shortages, medicine shortages.
This is completely wrong.
This is the government that has said this, the same government that is proroguing us, and we can't scrutinise that.
There will be plenty of food imported and plenty of domestic food.
We protect people, and the people who are meant to do that are us parliamentarians, and we are being shut up by this government. It's unacceptable.
If I may, this could also be aimed at Brussels, could it not? Because Brussels has always thought that there's some wiggle room with Parliament that could get no deal, make no deal go away. If they're now told actually Parliament can't do it, then they might be forced to compromise on their own position with this. You don't believe it? Is that the way this government is playing it?
Well, I'm sure the government
using Parliament as a pawn in its negotiations with
Parliament
Brussels.
as a pawn, but the government is very strongly saying to the EU that you could improve on a no-deal Brexit, and why don't they now make actions to do so? Because they've served up a dreadful withdrawal agreement which doesn't get us out, which takes our money and doesn't allow us to be an independent country. They either improve on that or we just leave.
OK. John Redwood, Lena Moran, got to leave it there. Thank you very much. Let's go to Jackie at number 10. Jackie.
Well, welcome back to Downing Street. There's no noise at all from number 10, but at the gates of Downing Street there have been hundreds of protesters gathered for the last 3/4 of an hour, singing to the tune of Oh Jeremy Corbyn. They seem to be singing Get Rid of Boris. They've been there now for about 3/4 of an hour, no sign of them going home. Well, back to Scotland now, where First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has described this as a dark day for democracy, saying Boris Johnson was acting more like a dictator than a Prime Minister. Our Scotland correspondent Kieran Jenkins spoke to her earlier, and he also caught up with the Scottish Secretary, Alistair Jack. Kieran joins me now from Edinburgh. Kieran, what did they tell you? What can you tell us?
Well, just to reprise that breaking news, first of all, that Ruth Davidson's closest aides say she is set to resign as... Ruth Davidson's closest aides not denying she is set to resign as Scottish Conservative leader. And one reason, of course, that she's been unhappy was the sacking of her ally, David Mundell, as Scottish Secretary. And right on cue today, his replacement popped up in Edinburgh, very much on message with Boris Johnson in terms of the reasons put forward for suspending Parliament. The Speaker of the House of Commons says that this is a constitutional outrage. Do you agree with him?
Absolutely not. We are giving plenty of time to debate it. We need to have a Queen's speech. We have a new Prime Minister. He needs a new legislative programme.
Why is
Thank
he
you
wrong?
very
He's
much.
the arbiter of our democracy. Mr. Jack, no, that's not an answer to the question. I'm afraid that's not an answer to our question, Mr. Jack. Plenty of time? Well, the Scottish Secretary wasn't hanging around to define that. But as for MPs' hopes of blocking no deal in Parliament, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon told us she wasn't convinced there was now time to pass the necessary legislation. And what she wasn't doing today was using this moment to suggest a different route to independence. But we do now appear to be in a more treacherous phase in terms of relations between Holyrood and Westminster. And I asked Scotland's First Minister if she took Boris Johnson at his word that suspending Parliament was not about scuppering moves to stop no deal.
Let's be blunt and frank about this. Closing down Parliament in order to force through a no-deal Brexit that everybody knows is going to do deep and lasting damage to people the length and breadth of the UK is not democracy, it's dictatorship. And if the House of Commons doesn't come together next week to stop Boris Johnson in his tracks, then today will go down in history as the day any semblance of UK parliamentary democracy dies.
I can tell you that opponents of no deal aren't waiting around either. Here in Edinburgh, there's already a court case set for next week that has the support of 70 cross-party MPs. That was to try and use the Scottish court to prevent Boris Johnson from suspending Parliament. Now it's become a case to try and get him to unsuspend Parliament. I'm joined here by Joanna Cherry QC as the lead petitioner in that case. We'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, Ruth Davidson, Scottish Conservative leader, looks like she's set to resign, and you lose perhaps one of your most formidable opponents to Scottish independence.
Well, I do rather wonder now who will lead the campaign against independence in the coming referendum. But what I would say about Ruth Davidson's impending resignation is that if Ruth is not prepared to tolerate government by Boris Johnson, then why should the people of Scotland tolerate government by Boris Johnson? But the thing you need to understand about Ruth Davidson, she's in a very difficult position because she's failed to represent the views of Scotland, which voted 62% to remain. She's failed to represent the views of her constituents in Edinburgh Central, and I represent part of Edinburgh Central and Edinburgh South West. 75% Remain vote in Edinburgh, and I can tell you from the reaction I've been getting on the streets of Edinburgh today and in my email inbox, people in Edinburgh are very angry about this prorogation, and people in Edinburgh who would not have contemplated voting for independence 5 years ago now want an independence referendum and want to vote for independence.
We don't know her reasons for stepping down, but it does make your job a bit easier, doesn't it, if she's not around to oppose independence, certainly not in the capacity that she was before?
Well, I don't think it was a one-woman job opposing independence. Ruth Davidson certainly is a politician with formidable qualities.
Well, she cut the number of seats you would have won here otherwise.
Well, which is a way...
And she took rather a lot of seats away from the SNP at the last general election.
First of all, she replaced the Labour Party as the official opposition here. The SNP still have more than twice as many seats as her here, and we're only 1 or 2 seats short of a majority here. And of course, there's a by-election in Shetland tomorrow where it looks like there might be a major upset. Insofar as Westminster is concerned, she did win seats back off us, but we still have more seats than all the other parties put together.
But we're running out of time, so let me just ask you about your court case. You think you can unsuspend Parliament through the Scottish
Parliament hasn't
court?
been suspended yet. That's planned for the week after next. But we've already got a court action before the courts that was due to be heard next Friday. We've filed today for an urgent motion to get the court to hear the case tomorrow or Friday to suspend the effect of today's decision.
You're reacting to events here, aren't you? Do you think that basically you've been outmanoeuvred?
Well, I don't think we've been outmanoeuvred. I think the British government have been disingenuous. Part of their defence to our action when we filed it a month ago was that the question was academic, so they've been disingenuous. Okay. I'm confident we've got reasonable prospects of success tomorrow or Friday.
Joanna Cherry, thank you very much indeed. Jackie, back to you.
Now to tonight's main news, the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament for more than a month. The official reaction from the European Union has been no comment, but some politicians have reacted with disbelief. The European Parliament's Brexit coordinator described the decision as sinister. Here's Jonathan Rugman.
If there was a summer recess from the turmoil of British politics, it ended today. The very silence of the House of Commons, now itself the subject of rancorous debate. MPs are due to return here next Tuesday, but the chamber will shut again the week after that, precisely when its members most want to be heard. It took a visit by 3 Conservative Privy Councillors to the Queen here at Balmoral to deliver the Prime Minister's request for her approval. She gave him what he wanted, Parliament suspended for as long as 5 weeks. But opposition leaders said they had then written to the monarch asking to see her urgently.
Suspending Parliament is not acceptable, it's not on. What the Prime Minister is doing is a sort of smash and grab on our democracy in order to force through a no-deal exit from the European Union.
In fact, whether it is a deal or no-deal Brexit emerging from a European summit on October the 17th, Boris Johnson is accused of burying democracy by giving Parliament almost no say.
There will be ample time on both sides of that crucial October the 17th summit, ample time in Parliament for MPs to debate the EU, to debate Brexit and all the other issues.
In Paris today, the stalemate over the so-called backstop appeared to repeat itself.
As the European Council has consistently made clear, the withdrawal agreement, including the now famous backstop, cannot simply be renegotiated.
And Boris Johnson's long-time nemesis in Europe described the shutting down of Westminster as a taking back control which has never looked so sinister. MPs themselves could now try to bring down the government with a confidence vote next week, or try to legislate against a no-deal Brexit. But unless the Queen changes her mind, time is not on their side to decide anything at all.
Jonathan Rugman. Well, joining me now is the Brexit Party MEP Ben Habib and Alistair Campbell, now the People's Vote campaign, and Tony Blair's former Director of Communications. Ben Habib,
good evening,
good evening. Brexit was all about restoring the sovereignty of Parliament. So
absolutely.
Today you must be deeply upset that Parliament has been made irrelevant for 5 weeks.
Well, I think it is a great shame that Boris has chosen a contrivance to try and get his way with whatever his plan is. You know, the Remain lot of the MPs in Parliament who are effectively predisposed to Remain have used every trick in the book to try and frustrate Brexit. And really, to give effect to Brexit, it would have been nice to have done it without having to use a contrivance. I don't think what he's done today is an abuse of democracy, but what he has done is definitely use a contrivance.
Has this contrivance made you irrelevant, the Brexit Party?
Not at all, no. I mean, I think this contrivance actually tees us up for much greater things to come, because I don't think Boris is going for no deal. I think Boris is going for maximum pressure on the European Union, giving all the signals that he's going for no deal, but actually what he really wants is the backstop removed, and then I think he's going to bring the withdrawal agreement back to Parliament for the 4th time. It's a wretched agreement, and I very much hope Parliament reject it.
So you feel a little bit irrelevant at the moment. Alistair Campbell, do you feel a little bit irrelevant at the moment?
I've been irrelevant for years.
Okay, but you know, the People's Vote campaign, frankly, no one's talking about it. I know we've had this discussion before. How does that ever come back into discussion?
Well, there's all sorts of ways it comes back into the discussion, but the main route is one where the issue itself doesn't get resolved. So, and it's interesting to hear Ben there, because what you're seeing, because of Boris Johnson's character and what we know about him, nobody trusts him. And this is the guy who at the weekend, when you were being snubbed in Biarritz, was saying that they weren't going to prorogue Parliament. Now they're doing it. So I think eventually, I've said this thousands of times, eventually I think this issue is so important, so fundamental, it will have to go back to the people.
By the way, would you have told your former boss, Tony Blair, to do interviews today? Proper sit-down interviews?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yes, definitely.
You were the keeper of the Holy Grail, you know.
No, not at all. Listen, one of the things about that I've noticed about Boris Johnson, he's definitely trying to emulate Trump in terms of his communication strategy. But listen, the public are really anxious at the moment. They really care about the decisions. They're following this very, very closely. It's the duty of the Prime Minister to explain, and it's the duty of a Prime Minister to subject himself to accountability and scrutiny in Parliament.
But the way this is going to be resolved is with a general election. That seems almost inevitable, doesn't it?
Well, it's possible.
Vote.
It's possible. But it's also possible, by the way, don't forget the last general election, Theresa May thought she was going to get a landslide. The public decided something very different. Johnson sitting in Downing Street is imbibing all the propaganda from the right-wing newspaper, is loving the fact of being Prime Minister and having power. He has got a big shock coming to him because the people are not going to let him get away with it.
Ben Habib, is the Brexit Party doing deals, looking at the electoral map with the Tories in order to make sure that when there is a general election, that you don't stamp on each other's turf?
We haven't done any deal, but what we did declare yesterday was that if Boris Johnson would promise a clean Brexit, by which I mean a WTO Brexit, we would then do a non-aggression pact with the Tories, absolutely.
He can promise that. It doesn't mean that he'll be holding himself to his own word.
Well, he would have to evidence it. He would. He would. He would. We are deeply suspicious. He would have to evidence it by deselecting or getting his party to somehow deselect all those MPs who stood in the way of Brexit so far, the Tory MPs. There are about 40 of them.
Well, they're the ones who are going to have to stand up soon.
But also, at the end of the day, I mean, the people who really want a no-deal Brexit is basically you and a minority of the country, according to the polls. At the end of the day, everyone is sick and tired of this process. If it's a Brexit, you know, with a kind of deal that Boris might be able to get from the European Union, then that's what's going to prevail.
The withdrawal agreement is not Brexit. The withdrawal agreement It keeps us absolutely in lock with the European Union, with no say whatsoever. We would have to take their regulations. We would be subject to ECJ oversight. We would be having to give up our fishing waters back to Europe.
This just shows the fundamentals have not changed. They've not changed today.
Okay.
So he's played a little power game. You call it a contrivance, but I don't believe it's got him any closer to his goal.
If it comes to a decision between a no-deal Brexit and a deal Brexit, what would you go for?
Say that again?
A no-deal Brexit or some kind of deal. What would you go for?
I'll keep fighting. We'll keep fighting because, look...
Shouting in the wilderness?
No, it's not shouting in the wilderness. We weren't shouting in the wilderness when Theresa May said she was going to be out by March the 29th. And she's now the one who's out. And Boris Johnson is not as... This today is not the act of somebody who feels strong and confident. It's the act of somebody who feels weak and is scared of both public and MPs.
In 10 seconds, only last night did the opposition groups, the Remain groups, get together with a strategy.
Yeah.
They should have done that 3 years ago.
Yeah, but they've done it. And at last...
Too late?
No, I hope it's not too late. And yes, he's trying to cut Parliament's legs away from it, but there is still time to go down the legislative route, which they agreed yesterday they're going to do.
Right, OK. Alistair Campbell, Ben Habib, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Now, before we go, childhood and happiness, two words that should be synonymous. But young people are more unhappy than they've been for a decade, according to the Children's Society annual Good Childhood Report published today. The topics children said made them happy, family and friends. The issues that make them worried included crime, climate change and, yes, Brexit, mostly what's on this programme. So we leave you with the views of some young people that we spoke to today, playing where else but in a park in the shadow of Parliament. Good night.
Some things that are a bit worrying, like climate change and things like that. I had this fact that if we don't do anything now, in 2040, it will be the first year with no ice in the Arctic.
Sometimes I worry about like stabbings and like shootings and the crimes that are happening in like London and the places in England, and like I don't want to be a part of that, and I want other people to be safe as well.
I understand how some people might want to exit the EU. It personally doesn't worry me, but I understand how it might worry some people about jobs, people who have a passport from here, who work in the EU, and people who have passports in like France, who work here.
I don't want it to affect my future because, well, it's my future and I want to do stuff the way I want to do it. But because of the whole Brexit thing, I might not be able to do what I want to do.
Things that make me worried is about my family in Afghanistan, because I just came back 3 days ago and there was loads of bombs and I was kind of scared.
I don't really worry about much, as I know that I am safe when I am around people I know.